Sarah, thank you so much for remembering that Girl Scout motto. That was really impressive. And so the next time you and I are playing darts and you start destroying me and trash talking, I'm going to remind you about that Girl Scout motto, and hopefully that will do me some good.
It only applies when I have my vest on.
All right, well, I'm going to get a hold of a vest and put one on, and then I will be a fellow Girl Scout. But it was fun. I hope we get to play darts again sometime soon. It was a lot of fun. You know, the very beginning of Jesus' ministry is at a wedding. He's at a banquet, hanging out with his friends. I imagine in the scene, like many of us who gather and see friends after a long time and we're not, really needed anywhere. No one's really looking for us. We tend to hide out in the kitchen or wherever the wine is kept. And, we're just catching up. We're having fun. Nobody's depending on us for anything. And then Jesus' mom, Mary, shows up and is like, you need to make some wine right now. And then there's the parable of the wedding banquet found in a couple of the Gospels, one of which we discussed last week. And today, there's this parable of a wedding and 10 attendants with lamps to help the groom out in the dark, possibly because he's one of the people that helped finish the wine. There's so many layers to a wedding. The planning, the guest list, and then there are all these lessons learned from weddings. One lesson is that as much as we want to make the day entirely about the people getting married, chances are the couple and everyone else is thinking about other people too. And the couple, those of you that have been a couple or in a couple that's been married at a wedding ceremony, you probably spent a lot of time thinking about everybody else and their experience. Another lesson for weddings is that there's no single right way to do one. I've heard some say, as they develop a metric around what a successful wedding will look like, is the absence of negatives. So long as no one faints up front or tries to stop the wedding, it will be a good wedding. So long as Uncle Gus doesn't get drunk and hit on everyone, it will be a good wedding. Ultimately, we hope just things go to plan or pretty close to plan. Now, in our text today, the wedding party gets highlighted, typically a group of people that are not front and center, but they're there, and their absence is missed, but people might even wonder, something's missing here. And they may or may not recognize it as these wedding attendants. They have lamps and oil. Some bring flasks just in case the timing of things takes longer than one might expect. How many of you have been to a wedding that starts exactly on time? Right? It's just part of the package. There's a lot of moving parts. And sure enough, like most weddings, things are taking much longer than expected. And those with the flasks replenish their lamps, and those without the extra oil run to get more oil. And while they're away, the wedding party moves on, and the folks looking for extra oil return to find themselves left behind. This is a really familiar parable to me, and I have so many questions. Always have. Why didn't those with the extra oil share? Why couldn't the ones who ran out of the oil just been like, oh man, I didn't really plan well, but can I stand by you and maybe carry your oil and we can both be part of this thing? Now, a common traditionalist interpretation of this parable, the kind of interpretation I grew up with, is you better be prepared or you're going to be left behind and the door to heaven's going to be closed for all eternity, right? Well, that just seems petty. So, where's the deeper meaning here? And in doing this, being a very familiar thing to me, I was like, my older son is working towards a master's degree in artificial intelligence. So I hear about these cutting edge things because he's worked in laboratories at UC Davis and et cetera. And he's been telling me about Chat GPT. And he's like, Dad, stop stressing about writing your sermons. Just use Chat GPT. You could do it Sunday morning and spit it out. And I'm like, okay. So being the curious type, I was like, what is this? And I tend to be an early adopter of things. So I get myself into Chat GPT, and it's really easy to find. Anybody else here been in there? Yeah, it's kind of fun. Creepy, but fun. And so I get in there and enter into Chat GPT, Sermon Parable of the 10 Virgins, because that's kind of what it's often called. And immediately, a fairly well-written essay pops up with a stale set of perspectives that we've all heard before 1,000 times. And then I entered a few variations of searches. Sermon, Wise and Foolish at the Wedding, Wedding Oil Lamps, and a few others. And then I went through the list again and added at the beginning progressive Christian versions. And there was a shift from conservative traditional perspective to traditional mainline Protestant perspectives. And frankly, also a stale set of perspectives that many of us have already heard. You see, ChatGPT just simply draws upon what's already there and pulls it together in some fashion. And it occurred to me, again, and I don't mean this disrespectfully, but an observation. Am I okay? It's just me. That pastors, preachers, theologians have been doing Chat GPT stuff forever. Right? You just go to the library, you pay for a resource. I didn't know this till I got to seminary, but you can actually buy sermon series and preach them. I was like, what? What's all this school for then? And so I'm sitting there, and I was like, I don't really want to do that. That's not how I do things. And yet there is this pull, because in the establishment seminaries and places of higher learning that are part of the mainline Protestant world, which we are part of, you get sort of demeaned and devalued and not taken seriously unless you give these lengthy treatises and accolades and make direct connections to church fathers, European thinkers, and theologians. But then those of us who are anti-colonial theologians, womanist and feminist and queer theologians, the only reason we usually bring up those voices is to say at best, let's pick up where they left off. And more often, it's time to leave that in the past. Now, I want to be really clear that I do not claim to have the fresh, innovative, vanguard theological perspectives. Chances are, like in the book of Ecclesiastes, there is nothing new under the sun. I think it might be new batteries. Can we just pause here for a minute while I get some fresh batteries. Hopefully this is it. All right. Nothing new under the sun, but I do try to do the work of staying open to the nudge of the Spirit into directions that on my own would not have arrived. Sometimes it happens and sometimes it doesn't. So there I am looking at the many windows of ChatGPT essays wondering, now what? Then a voice starts whispering, just take the easy way out. Say the same old stuff. Just paraphrase the essay. Make it sound like you. That feels so gross. And so I literally lifted my right arm, moved it over to my left side, and flicked that voice off my shoulder. And then another voice says, it's better to say nothing than keep rehashing stuff that hasn't been relevant or meaningful for decades. And I sat there and pondered that for a minute, walking up here and saying, hey, Parks, I have nothing interesting to share today. Our closing song is. And so I'm standing there, or actually sitting there looking at all these windows going, what now? What now? And I prayed, which I do a lot. And fortunately, something started creeping in. The imagery there is oil and lamps. And then what started to slide in was discipleship. Lamps, oil, discipleships. Oil and lamps, likely clay lamps, were ubiquitous at the time. The poor, the not so poor, the wealthy, everybody would have had lamps. Discipleship requires from us things we already possess. Lamps and oil. We don't have to go anywhere. We don't have to get special training or stock up on supplies. We just need to be ready to be prepared with what we have and contribute what we have to the cause for justice, for inclusion, for compassion, to make things on earth as it is with heaven. Now, with parables, things are symbolic. So the lamps and the oil are symbols of other things. If we showed up to the revolution with oil lamps, it's probably not going to go too far. But maybe. See, each of you has at least one lamp. Most of you have many. Each of you has plenty of oil. The question isn't whether or not you have what it takes. The question is, when the time comes, are you going to use it? And there are lots of times. And I am not intending to be an alarmist this morning. My preference is for us to all leave feeling good and happy. But I do believe, as we heard in some of the prayers, that we are nearing times of strife that we aren't accustomed to. And I'm deeply worried about the growing discontent and distrust of our institutions on top of the existing foundational paradigm of our nation, which is problem solving through violence, a Pax Americana, peace through strength, guns and the Marlboro Man. And now for decades, many of you for decades have been part of the chorus of voices rising up demanding justice. And we have joined our voices with those cries. for things that we have experienced as injustice and in solidarity with people who have experienced injustice that we have no idea about, but we're with them and we're not going anywhere. We too are lifting our voices in allyship and resistance, and our collective noise for justice, our demands, our lack of willingness to accept the status quo, these are dynamics that the fundamentalist white nationalist power structure is also not accustomed to. And neither side is going to back down. Now, there are some of us who might feel caught in the middle of this tug of war between justice and injustice, and I've tried to find middle ground in this dilemma, but when it comes to justice versus injustice, is there any legitimate middle ground? Those of us fighting on the side of inclusion and affirmation aren't going anywhere. Those who fear they have lost the glory days and want to return to a phantom greatness again, they believe they need to go back to the way things were to preserve their way of life, their validity of self. And this impasse has been brewing for a long while. And the kettle on the stove has been whistling softly. The temperature is rising, the steam is getting more intense, and the volume of the hiss is increasing. The kettle itself is beginning to rattle. And as I say this, I also say, do not fear. Because this is precisely what us justice seekers have brought forth. You hearing me? See, if we just stay quiet and recede into the background, that kettle is going to come off the heat. But I venture to guess that none of us here are ready to back down. Not because we're looking for a fight, not because we want violence to erupt, but in the words of Fannie Lou Hamer, we are sick and tired of being sick and tired. And the rattling kettle is because we are making progress. But hey, Rambob, they have guns. Indeed, they do. And we have our clay lamps and oil. Fragile earthen vessels indeed, designed to hold a fuel, a fire that shatters the deepest, darkest darkness and light our way forward. But hey, Rambob, they have guns. Indeed, they do. And we follow a leader who, with empty hands, stood nose to nose against one of the most brutal and violent empires the world has ever seen. Hey, Rambob, you know what happened to him? Indeed, I do. You see, discipleship comes at a cost. We are all here because we have heard a call to be disciples of a Jesus who is for all the people, a Christ who hears the cries. The din of materialism typically drowns out, but the Christ awareness hears this and responds to that call as an ally, a devoted companion, a flag bearer willing to throw his body into the gears of the machines that devour our humanity so that we have a chance to begin dismantling and repurposing those tools of destruction and turning swords into plowshares. Every season of Lent is an opportunity for us to dig deep, to have our eyes refocused and recalibrated by full awareness of the darkness that is around us, that is present. And for we, earthen vessels of flesh, filled with the oil of the Holy Spirit that burns brighter than anything our eyes have ever seen. It is time again. It is time continued for us to be gathered in solidarity and preparation, just as I am, just as we are, to show up with what we got, for that is enough. Amen.